He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content and support us at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host Taylor, and today we're diving into an interesting new creature spirit entity that hopped into my radar a few weeks ago actually, and since then I was just stewing on the idea of doing some research and just popping an episode out on it. But before we get to that, however, a couple of plugs. These past few weeks we've explored a variety of different topics, from demons, possession, extraterrestrials, and more. In addition, this past week, Reuben has actually been corresponding and doing some amazing research on a recent submission that we got from mysterious vocalizations on an individual's property. And if the timing and schedules align, then we'll be deep diving into this for next week's episode. That's my tentative goal, but stay tuned, because otherwise you'll see it on our social media channels for more information. X, YouTube, Facebook. And if you ever want to reach out to us directly, you can shoot us an email, cryptidclues@gmail.com. But without further ado, let's get into this. Now, throughout Mexico and Texas resides a fairly well-known legend of this entity. It shapeshifts into a large owl, and according to these legends, this creature was once someone who tampered with magics, a witch, technically speaking. So once they were exposed as a witch, they were executed by the townspeople or wronged. But that wasn't the end of it. The power of revenge proved deadly for this witch, and the witch had returned from the grave to enact revenge on those who murdered her or wronged her. Except the form that she returned as was this human-sized bird with the face of a woman. When I say bird, more or less basically like an owl. Now, that is all the baseline of the legend here, but there are other legends that some correspond and some kind of changed things a little bit. And over time, these legends do vary quite a bit. For example, in some of them, she's simply a vengeful spirit. In others, she is a woman that sold her soul to the devil in order to gain supernatural powers. Just the kind of stuff that when something like this occurs, something unknown, people like to expand on the stories a little bit. So it does become a little bit hard to weave through certain things. I mean, it's very difficult to ever find the truth when we're dealing with this kind of world, but it gets more difficult when more people add their spin to these narratives. Now, like I mentioned before, this creature, this being, holds the capability of transforming into a large 5 to 6 foot tall owl. And that is seemingly very consistent with this legend, while retaining the face of a woman. And now we've talked about larger aerial cryptids before, Thunderbird and Mothman as well, but those cryptids hold locations in different places of the world, as opposed to what we see here in this set places with the popularity regarding La Lechuza. Now, as far as sightings go regarding Lechuza, the giant white owl has been seen in the Mexican states of Chihuahua, Coahuila, Durango, Nuevo Leon, and Tamaulipas. In the States, however, it's been seen in Rio Grande Valley of Texas, which we mentioned earlier, being that state of Texas, and even some remote sightings in Southern California. But just touching back on Mexico, now, an owl holds a very symbolic representation of illness and death, with misfortune looming in upon its cries. And it's those cries of La Lechuza that reportedly bear a supernatural component to them by having the ability of luring either their prey or their target out towards her into a remote, isolated spot. Now, we've discussed this particular thing before, and the fact that it's attached to a completely different cryptid, it actually makes the hair stand up on my neck a little bit because of how similar this is. But just a side tangent here, there exists audio clips online of people out in the woods and they hear baby cries out in the middle of nowhere. There should be no baby out there. This is notably out in Alaska, actually, where I'm going to touch upon a video I recall watching called Alaskan Coastal Bigfoot, I believe. And in it, they discussed how there were these women that were out camping at this isolated cabin up north in Alaska. Individually, at separate occasions, they started to hear baby cries coming from the woods. And it wasn't until a few days later that someone finally mentioned it, and they all kind of breathed a sigh of relief, like, oh my gosh, I didn't want to say anything, but I thought I was the only one just hearing these things. But they realized they all were hearing them. Now, the speculation is that maybe that was a Bigfoot that was trying to rope them out, because that's usually something that you hear an affiliation with. Now, it's not proving that it's a Bigfoot doing it by any means, but usually you hear it and then there's Bigfoot activity in the area. And so that's where that bridge kind of comes together between those vocalizations and Sasquatch. But I think it's amazing when you look at that, how similar that is to La Lechuza, when you have these vocalizations attempting to lure out the target, the strange whistling sounds, eerie baby cry noises that are reported from a La Lechuza creature entity. And while we can see that connection, because, I mean, we don't have that scientific foundation, but we see this represented in other unknown cryptid experiences, particularly Sasquatch. And that's what really gives me the chills. So when we talk about those sightings here, reports, of course, rumored, don't include murder or missing persons cases when we're dealing with La Lechuza. Normally, sightings of this creature involve late night driving, giant owls swooping down on cars that are on deserted roads and such. That's a fair share of the things that I had found people talking about. But now, we discussed its height, but this creature has a wingspan of around 15 feet. And as far as sightings go, some reports online go back to around the 1950s. But we have to remember, since this origin and this legend stems from it being a witch that was wronged and the spirit becoming something truly horrific, as the legend goes, and assuming this isn't just a giant owl cryptid, we actually can look at how friars in Mexico started prosecutions for witchcraft back in the 1530s. And by the 1600s, witch hunts and devil pacts became quite the conundrum in Mexico. So we have a limited insight here because we weren't there, and we base this on what information that I've researched myself with whatever credibility you might deem me worthy of having as just a podcast host. But any supposed witch between the 1500s and 1900s could have been killed, and again, according to legend, have become this spiritual entity. And that's focusing on it indeed being something paranormal and not physical. But at least we have a rough gauge between dates now with the assistance of the internet. I'm going to expand a little bit more on those dates because they can go a little bit further back. I was touching on the 1500s because of the witch trials and because of what happens with Mexico with the friars and such there. But now, if we see how reports start in the 1950s here, the town of Nuevo Laredo was subject to the terror of La Lechuza. And as reports go, the locals even attempted to lure it out using a child as bait, only to fire upon the creature when it appeared. That's one report. And we were to jump ahead a few decades. In the late 1990s, there was a 9-year-old child that was living south of San Antonio in Texas, between two little towns called Von Ormy and Little. Now, the child was at home alone watching TV, and as dusk began to set in, the child heard some noises outside the home, thinking it was their father. So they went to investigate with excitement. However, it wasn't their father. Outside was a massive owl across the street from the child's home, just sitting at a picnic table that was there. It was just watching them. And the report claims that the owl was jet black in color, watched the child for around 15 minutes, but once the father actually did arrive home, it left. And the child had reported this. The grandmother who found out about this was a very religious woman, slightly aware of what this thing could be, and began implementing several prayers and practices to safeguard the family. The grandmother told the child about La Lechuza. However, the child didn't seem to express any fear or concerns regarding the creature. Now, owls in general, as we mentioned, have very powerful meanings behind them. We highlighted some of the interpretations in Mexico, but looking at North America here, something we have examined in the past is how aliens and owls share a certain connection, not based on fact, just based on observation by myself. These situations are very strange, but ultimately victims experience a manifestation and visualization of an owl in moments that are seemingly directly affiliated with some sort of extraterrestrial contact of some sort, either through abduction when sleeping or in a dream, or even following when seeing something unidentified in the sky. There's usually some kind of an owl connection that people seem to remember. It's interesting as it could almost be interpreted as like a trance, something to be calm or soothing or whatnot. But funny enough, we actually have two big owls that live near our house here, actually, but I digress. Owls can be traced back to early biblical days and beyond. Fear of owls is exhibited in China, ancient Greek, Roman times, even in ancient Egypt. They weren't portrayed as being a positive symbol. But touching back on another case here, Robstown, and some reports started stirring up in the fall of 1975. In October, police officers began receiving phone calls about a bird, specifically a monster bird, as callers were calling it. The descriptions shared the similarity of Lechuza, but the articles never mentioned that name specifically. They just labeled it as a monster bird. Additionally, reports came in that clocked this creature between 2 to 6 feet tall. And coincidentally enough, there were some reports that claimed human face. Minor reports claimed it had human feet and even other animal feet, and a fair amount of calls ended up yielding just different physical attributes, but the giant bird and human face were notably prominent in some of these reports. So where's Robstown? Well, it's Texas, of course. Hot, humid summers, generally mild, cool winters. As of 2020, the population was sitting around 10,000 people. And eventually, these sightings started to slow down here, but apparently they picked up elsewhere. Another city in Texas called Banquet, followed by the city of Alice, also in Texas. And so by January 1976, reports were still coming in of large bird sightings. 2 police officers from San Benito, Texas, of course, actually caught a glimpse of this creature themselves, and they noted its wingspan was between 10 to 15 feet as it flew over a nearby lagoon. So we're seeing some things being consistent here and some things not necessarily lining up. But there was so much popularity behind these reports that a local radio station actually offered a prize dollar amount of $1,000 for the live capture of this monster bird. And I find that quite humorous because we see this in so many situations with Bigfoot or other unfamiliar cryptids where town locals will set up a prize amount for existential proof. So people just go out in force to try and catch this thing or prove that it's going on. And it's a publicity stunt. By all means, of course, this radio station's just trying to do it because they're trying to get people talking about them and be popular. But then you get people that go out there and the damage this can do to this kind of community of like investigators and researchers, and the idea behind believing in something like this. When you see this kind of stuff, it can be dangerous. Not necessarily for, well, of course, for the cryptid that exists out there, because you don't want it to get shot if it's a real thing, but you're dealing with damaging the idea and the belief, because when people start to create hoaxes to try and swoop in and get that $1,000 from the radio station, and then maybe they're going to construct some fake bird, or they're going to take a staged fake photo of some kind, and it just yields very negative responses sometimes, if that makes sense. That's how I kind of view this kind of thing, even though it's done as like a publicity stunt as well, but I digress. This cryptid just seemed to dominate the state of Texas, if we want to call it a cryptid. It's hard to discern between that paranormal entity or that actual physical cryptid being of what this thing really is. But in the city of Brownsville, we have a man that was residing in his trailer, and he started to hear some very concerning noises outside one evening. Like the child we mentioned before, this man went to investigate, but upon looking outside, he spotted a 4-foot-tall bird, devoid of human physical attributes and features. This bird just had a long beak, massive large eyes, resembling more so a bat than a bird, as this person put it. And now, if we assume this was something different, like extraterrestrial in origin, perhaps owls aren't the only flying thing that aliens and UFOs might affiliate with. I mean, they could use whatever they want instead of just owls, but perhaps maybe this is another type of entity that extraterrestrials choose to display. But that's a very bold assumption, so take it with a very small grain of sand or grain of salt, whatever suits your fancy. Another unknown cryptid could be that. There are, like we said, Thunderbird, Mothman, other aerial cryptids that exist out there. Although the man that saw this monster bird outside his trailer told reporters, and I quote, That animal is not from this world. I was scared." End quote. And if we wanted to bring this down back to reality a little bit, zoologists claim that these reports are just people identifying an Andean condor. This popped up in our Thunderbird discussion as well, but it's a South American bird that can reach a wingspan of 10 feet. It's a pretty big bird. I suggest taking a quick Google of it so you can see, but whatever would draw it out to South Texas is still filled with uncertainty. It kind of baffles individuals and zoologists to think, why would it be out there that far? It's way out of its area, its home. But I like the idea of a giant bird out there doing bird things over aliens using owls as a sort of trance device, and evil witches luring you out into remote wooded areas. A giant bird cryptid sounds like the safest concept to run with, but that concept of witches itself is very ancient. You have, is it through fear, thought? I mean, in today's Western society, you have Wiccas, which is a movement that follow and practice witchcraft. And it's a much more easily explored concept in today's age, for sure, than it was back centuries ago. In early human civilizations, once a witch was deemed a witch, the punishments were pretty severe. And Romans and Greeks actually shared fears of witches in their time. The Salem witch trials, which, in my opinion, will forever be a truly horrific series of hearings and prosecutions. Many innocent people being accused of witchcraft in the colonial Massachusetts, starting back in 1692. There was actually a group of girls that were claimed to be possessed by the devil, followed by several local women accused of performing witchcraft. It was just very, very chaotic, and you have disinformation and everything going around, and people just being afraid. More than 200 people are actually accused at this time. 30 people were found guilty. The exact amount of deaths I found varied between reports, a little convoluted, but death was occurring through hangings, some cases being pressed under heavy stones. The other ones that they've mentioned, at least I learned in school, where they tie you up to this boulder and they throw you into the lake, and if you sink, well, you're not a witch. If you come back to the surface, well, you're a witch. It's just a lose-lose scenario all around. But in closing, without scientific proof, I do tend to view negative events as powerhouses for spiritual entities to reside and remain. If someone was murdered or possessed, for example, that leaves a mark. It's like stamping onto a piece of paper. And those entities remain in those locations or attached to those objects. And of course, Hollywood cashes in on this concept. But outside of that, like this case of Lechuza, a wrongdoing committed horrifically back in the witch trials of 1500s in Mexico, for all we know, causing such pain and torment, I am partial to believe that it could easily manifest into a spiritual entity that seeks to cause torment to others in encounters, or so the legend goes. But that's it. Thanks for listening to this week's episode, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. As I alluded to in the prologue, next week, if timing works out, Reuben and I will join forces again to discuss this vocalization submission that we'll be playing. We'll play the original. We'll play the broken down version that Reuben has edited, and then he will give his thoughts on the whole dissection. He did a great job. He sent me the email of his notes, and it's wonderful. I can't wait to talk about it and share it with all of you guys. But otherwise, be sure to check us out on our social media channels, X, YouTube, Facebook. And if you want to reach out to us directly, you can via CryptidClues@gmail.com. Until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.